The first speaker is Dr. Peter Collecott. Peter is the co-chairman of the Ambassador Partnership. He is also a former diplomat, a very distinguished diplomat, and he is also now an expert on the emerging political and economic world order. As a diplomat, he spent considerable time focusing, I think, on Brazil, the Arab world, and worked also extensively with the EU. Since retiring, he has become the advisor to major British multinationals with interests in Brazil, and he's also a special advisor to the Prince's Charities International Sustainability Unit, where he focuses on issues such as climate change, deforestation, and global food and water and energy security. I should say that there is more detail about each of these speakers' bios in the guide, but I hope that's sufficient for you to appreciate that this speaker has a very significant contribution to make. And may I ask Peter to come up and speak now. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Marina. Thank you very much indeed. First of all, let me thank the organisers for this invitation to speak to you today. It's a great pleasure, and it's a great pleasure to see that there is what I hope is increasing enthusiasm for expanding two-way UK-China trade and investment, whatever the uncertainties through which our two countries are living. As you, the experts, will soon discover, I am no expert on China, but as mentioned, I do have some views about what is going on in the UK and in the rest of the world, and how this might affect UK-China relations, in particular trade and investment relations. And I will have to leave it to those of you who are more expert on China to judge whether I've got those implications correct, and how the present situation might apply more specifically to the particular sectors or circumstances which you will be discussing in other sessions. First, before getting into Brexit, which will naturally be the main topic that I will discuss, let me just say a word about the Ambassador Partnership, of which I happen to be co-chairman. We are briefly a consultancy consisting of an extensive network of ex-ambassadors, both British ambassadors and non-British ambassadors. We do what we call corporate diplomacy, which means intermediating between firms like yours and foreign governments or public sector bodies. And we not only provide advice on doing that, we actually do the business of that kind of corporate diplomacy on the ground on behalf of businesses. We also work on behalf of foreign businesses, including Chinese businesses, wanting to establish themselves in this country, or indeed in present circumstances, just wanting to know what may be going on in this country, since it is slightly confusing. And in order to do this, we are registered lobbyists with the British government. And finally, we provide high-level training for major international organizations and foreign governments, training in issues such as leadership, negotiation, cross-cultural negotiation, etc. So, turning to the main topic, which is naturally Brexit, I guess it's stating the obvious that one of the major current issues for all UK's many trading partners, as for UK firms trading abroad, is Brexit. And this issue will undoubtedly continue to dominate politics and media in this country for the foreseeable future, as we move from prime ministerial speeches, such as we had this week, to the triggering of Article 50, to actual negotiations with the EU 27. However, in that whole process, we need to keep Brexit in some kind of perspective. As we saw from President Xi's speech at Davos this week, for China, and doubtless for most other countries, tomorrow's inauguration of President Trump and the implications of that are a much bigger deal. And indeed, even for many of our current EU partners, Brexit is more of an unwelcome diversion from more important issues like migration, like the future of the euro, and the rise of populism. All issues which are going to play very strongly, doubtless, in some very important elections in the Netherlands, France, Germany, and possibly Italy over this coming year. So, as I say, let's keep Brexit in proportion. Nevertheless, Brexit is undoubtedly the biggest political and economic issue for this country, the biggest issue for a couple of generations, the greatest cause of uncertainty for the next generation, and potentially, as others have said, the worst peacetime disaster for a century or more. And so, from quoting that, you may detect on which side of the fence I come down in the Brexit debate. However, I am a pragmatist. We have to try to ensure that exiting the EU does as little damage as possible, in particular to our trading relationships. We have to seize such opportunities as Brexit will offer, and to be very conscious also that with our trading relations with the UK's largest and closest market, namely the EU, in what one might say is unstable flux over the next few years, trading relations with other great countries and blocs, countries such as China, will be even more important than it has been in the past. And we need to get on with developing these other trade links, whatever Brexit may eventually bring for this country and our relations around the world. So, having said that, how do we try and make sense, some sense of what is going on, and develop strategies to mitigate risks and to seize opportunities? The first requirement I suggest is to focus on what matters for you. Brexit does indeed have significant implications for Britain's future relationship with the rest of Europe, for the future security architecture within Europe, probably for Britain's standing and influence in the rest of the world, and even possibly implications for the integrity of the UK if one looks at what is happening in Scotland. These issues are very important. They're also very interesting, but I suggest that they're not actually a first rank to those of you concerned with UK-China trade and investment. What matters here is what has been centre stage for a long time, namely Britain's future trading relationships with the rest of the EU, Britain's future trading relationships with the rest of the world, including China, and the future prosperity of the UK economy, the underpinning for all our trade. And overlaying all of these, I would suggest, the future attitudes in the UK. Will Brexit, as some fear, turn us into xenophobic little Englanders? Or will Brexit, as the Prime Minister hopes, provide a stimulus to greater global trade and investment? Just to take the last issue first, the central pitch of the Prime Minister is indeed, through her speech on Tuesday, was that freed from the EU, the UK will become a global champion of free trade. However, the government has been giving other signals. We had her Home Secretary flirting with forcing companies to reveal how many foreign workers they employ, and both of them curiously to me, refusing to resile from David Cameron's promise to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands, and indeed also refusing to remove foreign students from the figures for net immigration. So for me, the Prime Minister has not yet definitively resolved the tensions which there are, the tensions between a perceived need to placate anti-immigration voters in this country and her free trade rhetoric, and indeed the tension which I see between the need to address the concerns of those, quote, left behind by globalization, and the needs of the British economy. We haven't yet, thank God, come to the point of demands for protective tariffs from Little Englanders, but that could still come down the track. But this uncertainty means actually that there's an important role for you and for all of us, an opportunity for business to lobby forcibly in your own interest against protectionism, for free trade, and for a sensible, non-restrictive immigration policy as the Brexit negotiations rolled through. So in her speech this week, Theresa May set out her red lines. We've all read about them. Control of immigration and absence of jurisdiction of the European Court. And she explicitly ruled out membership of the single market. She also ruled out full membership of the customs union. More positively, perhaps, she said her aim was an ambitious free trade agreement with the EU to provide friction-free access to the single market, and she supported the idea of a lengthy transition period once the UK actually leaves the EU to avoid the so-called cliff edge. For me, this new clarity is welcome, but it does leave still a large number of questions unresolved. For instance, will a free trade agreement cover mutual recognition of standards as well as tariffs? Will it cover services as well as goods? What would the nature of any customs agreement that the Prime Minister talked about with the EU be? What special regimes or programmes the UK might wish to pay to retain membership of with our European allies? And more domestically, what will the UK's immigration policy be in future? So I'm not yet convinced that the disarray, if I can call it that, that we have seen within the British government over Brexit issues is completely gone. Until recently, Boris Johnson appeared to believe that sense would prevail and we could remain in the single market despite the Prime Minister's red lines. Liam Fox, clearly it appeared, wanted a hard Brexit, by which I think he meant no single market, no customs union, no transition period, allowing him to negotiate free trade arrangements around the world. And David Davis, to me, seemed to be stuck slightly in the middle, beginning to understand the complexity of the negotiations which he has to undertake, and beginning to contemplate compromises, such as paying to maintain select access to the single market and having transitional arrangements. We will have to wait and see. The Prime Minister's speech has not settled everything, as I said, and we will have to wait and see whether all the government is indeed on the Prime Minister's page, and whether her page doesn't amount to, as some commentators have said, another version of let's have our cake and eat it. We don't quite know. And as a last bit of commentary on that, there are also real timing issues. Firstly, the government appears to have spent so much time on getting its internal objectives and defining its objectives internally, that by the time Article 50 is triggered by the end of March, little time, it seems to me, will have been spent on how to achieve those objectives, let alone on fallback positions should the EU 27 not immediately fall into line with the eminent reasonableness of what the UK is proposing as a solution. We don't know yet whether the political situation in Northern Ireland will delay the triggering of Article 50. And the other factor is that, of course, because of the elections in Europe, nothing actually very substantial will happen in those negotiations between the UK and the EU until this autumn, after the German elections. Second timing issue, the Prime Minister talks of concluding the exit negotiations and those for a UK-EU free trade agreement within the 2-year Article 50 process. This is both unrealistic, as commentators have said, and not actually how others see it. The Germans, for instance, and they are crucial, have been absolutely clear that the 2 years needs to be spent on what they call the divorce negotiations, the EU-UK divorce negotiations, the Brexit negotiations, and that negotiations on a future relationship will actually start after that. The implication of that, which is not drawn out, is that on Brexit, there will be either a cliff edge or nothing will change. There won't be a transition, a start of a transitional period, because we will have no idea what that is transitioning to. That will have to be sorted out. So, enough for the generalities. What about the effects on trade, and in particular trade between the UK and China? The final outcome on trade clearly matters for Chinese and other investors in the UK. However, I would suggest it doesn't matter for all such investors. Large investments in infrastructure, for instance, will be more affected by the general economic climate and the general political climate in the UK than it will by the details of Brexit. And other investments, however, particularly those in manufacturing and services, which depend crucially on either supply chains going through the EU or on markets within the rest of the EU, and in some cases, of course, access to visas for foreigners coming into this country, may well be affected. The effects on these will depend on the details of the free trade arrangement, which we have with the EU, and the customs agreement, which we are said to expect, as well as the details of UK immigration policy. So there is, unfortunately, for those people, going to be a prolonged period of uncertainty, which they will have to live with. If we look the other way around, if we look at UK exports of goods and services to China, there should already have been considerable boost from the decline in sterling since the Brexit referendum, pushed now, as we've seen, by expectations of a relatively hard Brexit. But I suggest that in the future, the largest influence is on that flow of trade and investment outward from the UK to China is likely to remain Chinese growth rate, Chinese domestic regulation. But of course, for those who are exporting, for instance, educational services, which happen here, then of course what happens with UK immigration policy is also a significant factor for them. So, looking at some of those details of the EU-UK relationship, once the UK has left the EU, the UK will clearly lose any potential benefits from a EU-China protection investment agreement which is currently under negotiation. My understanding is that that is not too serious. The UK did not stand to gain very much from that investment protection agreement because there are already bilateral UK-China, UK-Hong Kong investment protection agreements. Not much to lose. However, there would have been quite a bit to be gained from an EU-China free trade agreement were it possible to negotiate one of those. It hasn't so far. And it seems to me that the chances of negotiating as an alternative a UK-China free trade agreement in the next few years are relatively slim. An acceptable early FTA, I think the chances are slim. Firstly, because the UK will not have the clout to get a good agreement, which the EU does. And secondly, because China may well prefer to prioritize other agreements, including concluding an agreement with the rest of the EU rather than with the UK. And also, thirdly, because I think it appears to me that the emerging policy of the Department of International Trade here appears to be on what one might call crystallizing UK Ruritania free trade agreements from existing EU Ruritania free trade arrangements where they exist, rather than the more difficult business of negotiating free trade arrangements where there is no EU agreement in place already. The one difference, the one exception to that may be a UK-USA deal, which may well be pushed for political reasons from this end as from the US. So, in summary, my analysis is that not much will change on the UK-China trade front. We have to, however, be careful about UK policies on visa as we take back our own immigration policy, and we have to be wary lest the UK in future slip behind other countries in terms of their trade access to China because of the reduced weight that we have in trade negotiations. And there is, however, lastly, a Trump wild card here. As well as an early trade deal with the UK, as we know, President-elect Trump has promised to make US and China trade fair, whatever definition of fair he may have. If that's not a simple process, if it does lead, as it may well do, to a US-China trade war, then that would not be good for the world economy, it would not be good politically, but on the other hand, it may throw up opportunities for UK exporters to and investors in China, and those are opportunities which people should be able to grab, provided that they do not run foul of any US-imposed sanctions on China as part of that trade war process. So finally, and I apologize for running on, let me just draw 2 or 3 conclusions. So what are the best strategies for companies interested in this two-way trade between the UK and China? I offer the following suggestions in all humility as a non-expert. Firstly, I would suggest do not be passive. Do not just wait for things to happen. In this time of massive uncertainty, what in another context Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, has called radical uncertainty, try to create whatever certainty you can, lobby governments, do not let Little Englanders or others win out. That would not be a winning commercial proposition for you. Make clear to policymakers your preferences for future trade regimes and for future UK immigration policy. I've been told authoritatively that in the run-up to the EU referendum, the only entities which lobbied the British government successfully were the Japanese government and 1 or 2 very large Japanese firms. The others, in the words of my interlocutor, were useless, unquote. I think that is an indictment of everybody else who should be lobbying in the interests of their shareholders in the directions which they see fit. Secondly, if I may, I suggest there's no reason to be hesitant about exporting to or investing in China. If there are opportunities out there, grab them. It makes no sense to me to wait until the Brexit and Trump fogs clear. That may not happen for some while, and the results may not be very important for that way of trade. Thirdly and finally, in uncertainty, try to remain flexible. The UK still looks very attractive for domestically orientated Chinese trade and investment. So there's no reason not to grasp those kind of opportunities in those kind of areas. There are inevitably, as I've spelt out, more questions and question marks over trade and investment for which supplies from or markets in the EU are important. However, there's a long way to go, as I've said, before there'll be clarity about UK-EU relations post-Brexit, and I suspect that down the track there will still be some political surprises, some of Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns which will hit us. Let us hope that those surprises are positive. If so, great, let's take advantage of them. In case they are not, I would suggest build up some resilience in your positions and have some plan Bs in case those unknown unknowns turn out not to be quite so friendly. Those are my suggestions. I think I better leave it there with apologies for overrunning. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Peter, for that perspective. Plenty to debate and discuss there, I think, during the course of the day.